Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? It helps us make quality content for you. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
The engine roared like a monster outside, rattling the windows and making the coffee cup on the table shiver in place. I dropped the wrench in my hand and sprinted to the porch boots, slapping against the wooden planks and my heart already pounding. Before I even saw it, there it was, a gleaming red tow truck backing down my gravel drive, its tires kicking up clouds of dust that curled around the dry corn stalks and scattered a flock of birds into the sky. The driver leaned out his window sunglasses, flashing and a smirk on his face as he pointed toward my tractor. My tractor, Old Blue, had been in my family for 73 years, and she sat proudly near the barn, rusty in spots but faithful through 3 generations of planting and harvesting. Now this stranger was lowering his rig and backing up to hook her as if she were scrap on a city street. I stormed down the steps, gravel crunching loud underfoot, and shouted over the roar of his engine, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tiu. Driver didn't flinch. He reached into his vest and handed me a folded paper per HOA directive. "We've been authorized to remove unauthorized vehicles from community grounds, sir." Community grounds. I blinked, sweat mixing with dust on my brow. As I unfolded the paper and stared at the official-looking document full of legal gibberish, and somewhere in the middle in bold font, the words Homeowners Association Directive 14B, Unauthorized Machinery Removal, stood out like a slap to the face. "This was my land," I muttered, my voice dry even to my own ears. "This isn't a subdivision, it's a damn farm." The truck's winch began to whine, steel cables tightening like a noose around Old Blue's front axle, and then I heard the heels clicking on pavement, crisp and precise like a courtroom gavel. I turned and saw her for the first time in person. Claire Dubois. Her reputation had preceded her, ever since the new development opened across the road. 2 years ago, she'd marched in like a queen, crowned herself HOA president, and made it her personal crusade to purify her precious community of any and all visual imperfections. Now she stood on the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, and sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose, a perfectly ironed blouse tucked into beige slacks that looked allergic to soil. Her lips curled into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," she said in a syrupy voice that made my spine itch. "I understand this must be a little jarring, but you've been in violation for several weeks now, and we've been more than patient." I stepped between the tow truck and the tractor, planting myself like a tree in storm wind. "You're trespassing," I said through clenched teeth. "This land's been in my family since before your little neighborhood even had a name, and there's no HOA jurisdiction here." She clicked her pen and made a note without even looking up. "That's debatable," she said. "We've recently expanded our covenants to ensure visual continuity for the surrounding area. Your machinery, unfortunately, is considered an eyesore under Clause 19, subsection D." Her words sounded like a rehearsed monologue, a theater performance in legalese. And arrogance, I pointed toward the dirt road, the invisible line where my property began and hers ended. "You can't just redraw boundaries to suit your mood." Claire finally looked up, her eyes cold as a winter pond behind those reflective lenses. "You'll want to cooperate, Mr. Collins, or things will get very inconvenient for you very quickly." I stared at her dumbfounded as the cables tightened and Old Blue's front wheels lifted off the ground. The sound was a groan of metal betrayal and history. "Being ripped away from its roots, you're stealing private property," I shouted, backing toward the truck, now driven by rage more than logic. "You think I won't press charges?" Claire shrugged, adjusting her sunglasses. "By all means feel free to seek counsel, though I should warn you our legal team is exceptionally experienced in matters of compliance." My fists were shaking, but I couldn't stop the truck now, not without getting myself arrested or worse. And as the driver climbed back into his cab and began to reverse, I stood in a storm of dust and diesel fumes, helpless as 73 years of family history was dragged down the drive like junk. Claire turned to leave, heels tapping away without a second glance. "Have a pleasant day, Mr. Collins," she said, like a mockery, like a slap in the face. I watched them disappear past the mailbox, past the fence line, past the new vinyl homes across the road that all looked the same. Painted smiles and artificial lawns, and HOA flags fluttering in the breeze. The sun dipped low over the hills, throwing long shadows across the fields. My fields, and I felt a coldness settle in my chest, not from the air but from something deeper in understanding. This wasn't about aesthetics or boundaries or tractors. This was war, and I wasn't going to fight it her way. Not yet, but I would. I turned and looked at the place where Old Blue had stood only moments ago. The ground still grooved with tire marks, the scent of diesel still lingering in the air, and I felt something shift inside me like the first spark inside a furnace. She thought I was just an old farmer with dirt on my boots and no fight in my bones. But she hadn't met my mother. She hadn't read our history. She hadn't seen what happens when you push a man too far on his own land, and I was going to make sure she learned every painful lesson firsthand. The county office smelled like dust and bureaucracy, the kind of place where time moved slower than paperwork, and no one ever made eye contact unless they had to. I stood at the counter holding a copy of my land deed, my jaw tight, my patience thinner than the faded carpet beneath my boots. The clerk glanced at the paper, then at her screen, her acrylic nails tapping keys with lazy precision. "You're not in a residential zone," she said, without looking up. "You're zoned agricultural unrestricted. Since 1956, that's old enough to predate most of our digital files. Then how the hell can an HOA touch my property?" I asked, voice low but strained like a wire pulled too tight. She shrugged in a way that made me want to flip. Her desk, "They can't legally. But sometimes these HOAs get bold. They bluff folks into compliance unless someone pushes back. Most people just roll over." I didn't roll over. I drove home past Claire's neighborhood where every lawn was clipped, like military haircuts, and porch swings hung untouched like props on a stage. I watched kids ride bikes on sidewalks they weren't allowed to chalk on, and dogs barked behind fences with HOA-approved slats. When I got home, I found a neon orange sticker slapped on my barn door. It read, "Structure violation unsafe per HOA guidelines." Beneath it was a list of codes printed from some HOA handbook that had nothing to do with my land or my rights. I peeled it off slow, letting the sound tear through, the silence like ripping skin, then walked inside the barn and slammed the door behind me. Later that week, a drone buzzed above the cornfields, hovering just long enough for me to grab my slingshot and fire a pebble, dead center. It dropped into the dirt with a satisfying thunk, and I raised a hand to wave at the house across the road where I knew Claire was probably watching. The next day, I received a printed notice in my mailbox, accusing me of violent behavior toward HOA property and demanding compensation for damages. It was unsigned, but I didn't need a name. The stench of entitlement was all over it. I started keeping a journal, writing down every drone, every sticker, every piece of fake legal garbage they dropped on my porch, because I knew what this was now. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was a siege. And Claire was laying claim to land she couldn't legally touch by wearing me down one insult at a time. The worst came that Sunday. I was working on the irrigation line near the fence when I heard voices laughing loud and fake, the kind of laugh that meant someone was putting on a show. I walked up the hill and saw Claire with a group of HOA board members standing just on their side of the property line, holding coffee cups and lawn chairs like they were tailgating. One of them pointed at my barn and said something I couldn't hear, but they all laughed again, and Claire waved her hand like a queen dismissing a jester. I crossed the line and walked up to her. Eyes locked, fire burning in my chest. "You find this funny?" I asked, nodding toward my fields. "You think it's a joke harassing a man on his own land?" Claire didn't flinch. "I think it's tragic," she said sweetly. "That one stubborn man would rather cling to rust and weeds than embrace community standards. It really is sad." I took a step closer. She didn't back up. "Try this again and I'll call the sheriff." She smiled and sipped her coffee. "Please do. We've already briefed them. They said it's a civil matter and they'll stay out of it unless there's violence, and I don't think you're foolish enough to go that far. Are you, Mr. Collins?" I turned away before I said something I'd regret back in the barn. I climbed into the loft to get some air and found an old cedar box covered in dust tucked behind my mother's quilts. The latch creaked open, and inside were photos, deeds, letters, and a worn leather journal with her name written in faded ink. Sat cross-legged and flipped through the pages, reading her words like whispers from the past, stories of hard seasons. Local fairs, early mornings, and late nights. She wrote about developers who tried to buy the land out from under her father, about meetings with county officials about holding her ground. She wrote about pride and legacy and about the barn my grandfather had built by hand with timber milled from our own trees. She wrote about the day they filed paperwork to have the property listed for historical review. The documents were still inside, folded neatly in an envelope stamped and signed from years ago. My hands trembled as I held them because I realized something. Claire didn't understand what she was attacking. This wasn't just a piece of dirt and wood. This was history. This was a monument to grit and survival, and she had no idea what kind of storm she was walking into. But I needed more than a legal defense. I needed to fight fire, with fire, not with anger, but with exposure, because people like Claire didn't fear law. They feared embarrassment. They feared losing control. I closed the box and carried it down like a treasure. And as I set it on the table, I heard my niece Emily pull into the driveway. Music blasting from her car and tires crunching like a call to arms. She stepped out chewing gum and holding her phone up to film the sunset in that automatic way teenagers did these days. And I knew right then I had an idea forming in my head, something dangerous, something smart, something very public. She walked into the barn, eyebrows raised. "Uncle Jake, why do you look like you just solved a murder?" I held up the journal and smiled for the first time in days. "Because, sweetheart, I just found the body and the weapon, and now I'm going to bury Claire Dubois in her own rules." Emily leaned against the barn wall, phone still in her hand, eyes wide as I laid out the plan, each word sharper than the last. "You really think people will care about an old barn and a stolen tractor?" she asked, chewing her gum slower now, her voice caught somewhere between doubt and curiosity. I nodded and placed the documents on the table one by one. The deed, the historical review, the journal pages yellowed and delicate, and finally a photo of my grandfather standing shirtless beside, old blue covered in sweat and pride. "They'll care when it's framed right," I said. "They'll care when they see a community queenpin trying to bulldoze a legacy just to get a prettier view from her porch swing." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You want to make this go viral?" "No," I said. "I want to make it inescapable." She grinned and pulled up a recording app. We spent the next 2 days filming everything: the barn, the tractor's empty patch, the aerial view of the property line, the orange violation stickers peeled off one by one like scars being removed. I read from my mother's journal slowly, voice rough with purpose, while Emily edited it like a war documentary. We didn't just tell a story. We built a storm. We titled it, "My Tractor Was Towed by HOA Karens," on my own farm, and posted it with tags sharp enough to slice through the algorithm within hours. The video started climbing views faster than I could keep track. The comments poured in like gasoline to a fire. People were furious. Farmers in Iowa, lawyers in Texas, even veterans groups reposted it, calling it a disgrace, a mockery of property rights and history. Some offered help, others demanded justice, and one retired judge offered a pro bono consultation if things escalated legally. Claire stayed silent for 2 days. On the third, a certified letter arrived sealed with the HOA crest. Like some royal decree, it threatened legal action if I did not remove the video and issue a public apology for defamation, trespass, and cyber harassment. I posted the letter too. The views doubled overnight. The next morning I saw Claire standing at her mailbox, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching me with the icy restraint of a woman whose empire had been punched in the throat. I tipped my hat. She didn't wave. But the real blow came on Friday when Emily showed me a screen grab from the local news site. The headline was bold enough to knock the wind from anyone. HOA bullies farmer over tractor sparks national backlash. The story had legs now, and it ran fast. A reporter called that afternoon asking for an interview. I invited him over, told him to bring a camera, and when he stepped into the barn and saw the old cedar box, his face changed like he'd just stepped onto sacred ground. We filmed under the rafters while the light poured through the slats like God himself wanted this truth aired. I told them everything. The theft, the drone, the fake violations, the smugness, the silence. I held up the letter from Claire and let the camera linger on her signature. They aired it that night in full, across the street. Claire's house went dark before sunset, like she couldn't bear to see the light of her own spotlight. The fallout came fast. Several of her board members resigned, By Monday, two of them claiming they had no idea the extent of the harassment. One even called to apologize and offer information about internal discussions. I thanked him and took notes. Every detail was ammo. Every email thread he forwarded was another nail in her coffin. But Claire didn't back down, not yet. She filed a formal complaint with the county trying to claim I was in breach of zoning, despite the very documents that proved otherwise. It was a desperate swing from a cornered animal, and I knew it, so I swung back. Emily and I made a second video, sharper, meaner, unapologetic. It opened with the line, "This is what happens when petty power meets real legacy," and ended with footage of Old Blue being dragged down the drive, her wheels spinning helplessly, while Claire stood smirking at the edge of my property. We slowed it down. We added music. We overlaid her own words from our confrontation as subtitles. Her quote about visual continuity rang out like a funeral bell. When it hit 1 million views in 2 days, someone tagged a congressman. When it hit 2 million, someone started a petition demanding my tractor be returned and Claire removed from her HOA position. When it hit 3 million, a local historical society released a statement of support offering legal aid and demanding Claire cease all actions until a formal hearing could be held. I walked outside on the 6th day of the storm and found 3 reporters parked along the road. Drones humming, cameras pointed. At the barn, one of them asked me how I felt. I looked past him at Claire's porch, where she sat stone still behind a curtain as if hiding from consequences she'd never expected to knock so loudly. "I feel like history just fought back," I said, and that night I got the call. It was the tow truck company owner apologizing with sweat in his voice, claiming he'd been misled about the legality of the removal and offering to return Old Blue free of charge. No fines, no fees, just please no lawsuit. And please no more camera crews in his yard. I said I'd consider it after Claire apologized publicly. And in writing, he didn't laugh. She wouldn't either, because now the whole country was watching and there was no HOA clause in the world that could save her from that. The flatbed truck rolled up just after dawn, tires whispering against the gravel, like it knew it was carrying more than just metal and bolts. Old Blue sat on the bed, shining under the early light like a queen returning from exile. Her tires still, dusty from wherever she'd been kept, engine silent but proud. The driver stepped out, hat in hand, his eyes avoiding mine as he walked around the truck, checking straps and signing forms like he was performing penance for sins that weren't his. "She's all yours again, Mr. Collins," he said quietly. "No charge, no strings. I was told to let you know the HOA will no longer be involved in matters concerning your property." I nodded, but said nothing. The silence did more than any speech could. He backed the truck up to the barn doors and lowered the ramp, slow and careful, like he knew the whole world might be watching, and he wasn't wrong. Across the road, neighbors were gathering, lawn chairs on porches, coffee mugs in hand, whispering, behind sunglasses, pretending this wasn't the most exciting thing that had happened in years. Claire stood on her steps, lips tight, arms folded, watching everything like she still believed she had one last move to make. But I had beaten her Old Blue. Touched down with a soft thud, and I walked over, placing a hand on the hood like greeting an old friend. I climbed into the seat and fired her up. The engine roared to life, louder than I remembered, and I drove her in a full loop around the property, letting the engine speak where I no longer had to. That evening, Claire called. Her voice was ice over broken glass. "You've made your point, Jake, but this isn't over. You've humiliated me, dragged my name through the mud, and for what? Some tractor, some legacy that no one even cared about until you made them." "No, Claire," I said. "It's over because you never understood what you were messing with. This land, this barn, that tractor, they're not things, they're history, and you tried to erase them for aesthetics. You think you've won," she snapped. "I don't think anything," I said. "I know I did, and so does everyone else." I hung up before she could spit another word. The next day, her resignation letter hit. The HOA newsletter with the force of a meteor. It was clinical and bitter, blaming stress and community division. But the final line was what stood out the most, due to ongoing personal attacks. "I am stepping away from leadership effective immediately." The comments beneath it were brutal. People called her a tyrant, a fraud, a control freak. They posted memes of Old Blue with captions like, "HOA this and not your tractor, not your rules." Emily even made a short compilation of her worst quotes layered over footage of my fields in bloom, and posted it with the title Karen vs. Cornet hit 5 million views in 48 hours. But none of that compared to the moment that mattered most. A week later, I hosted a community dinner right there in the barn. String lights draped from rafter to rafter pies lined the tables. Old photos of my family hung on the walls, and Emily set up a projector playing our original video on loop for anyone who missed it. People brought casseroles, lawn chairs, bottles of wine, and folding tables. We sat shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors and strangers laughing, eating, telling stories under the warm hum of summer dusk. Halfway through, I stood on the barn steps. Old Blue parked proudly behind me and raised a glass. My family built this place with sweat and bare hands. They fought off storms, droughts, and debt to keep it standing. And I almost lost it to a rule book written by someone who never once asked about its history, but thanks to every one of you, we reminded them, and the world, that legacy still matters, that standing your ground still counts for something. The cheer that followed shook the walls louder than any engine ever had. Claire's house was dark that night. No porch light, no laughter, just stillness, the kind that follows defeat too heavy to speak. Emily came up beside me, camera in hand, and smiled. "You ever think you'd be famous for a tractor?" I laughed. "No, but I'd do it all over again if I had to, and this time I'd let Old Blue lead the charge." As the night settled and the barn echoed with music and clinking glasses, I walked out to the field and looked back at the place my mother wrote about all those years ago. It looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Justice had come not with fists or fire, but with truth, legacy, and a little bit of viral outrage. And as I stood there, the stars broke through the clouds above me, like the sky was finally ready to breathe again. I took off my hat, looked up, and whispered, "We're home, Ma, we're finally home."